Okay, good morning. Good morning, everyone. Good morning.
It's not, his hearing is really bad.
In the summer of 1998, in the sweltering heat in Washington, D.C., James E. Hansen testified to a Senate committee that he was 99% confident that global warming had begun, that the year's record temperatures and droughts were not part of the natural phenomena, not part of the natural variation, but rather were the result of a warming world. The administration didn't like Jim's testimony. They altered it, and he called them out for it. Jim's climate science colleagues said he was way too confident. He said that he was 99% confident, and his colleagues said that 70% would be a lot safer. But Jim would not back down, would not step back, and would not be silent. His stubborn courage was as important as the science. That night, all the television networks carried Jim's testimony. Because of his boldness, his forthrightness, and because he wouldn't mince words, the world could never forget, would not forget, that global warming had begun. In 2008, 20 years later, when I was trying to get a fledgling citizens climate lobby off the ground, I flew to Washington, D.C. to hear a panel on something called carbon fee and dividend. I didn't know what it was. On the panel, on the left end of the panel, sat Jim Hansen. I had never met him, but already he was my hero. I had been using his slides and his quotes for almost a year, and there he was in person, not 30 feet away. Since then, in his many talks and interviews, Jim frequently says, if you care about saving the climate, the most effective thing you can do is to join Citizens Climate Lobby. More than 1,000, well over 1,000 of our volunteers attribute their participation to Jim. So Jim, I know I saw you. Come on up on the stage. I know you're here. Where are you? There you are. Yeah. On this day, almost exactly 30 years ago today, After Jim's Senate testimony, Citizens Climate Lobby is humbled and honored to present Jim Hansen with his first ever Voice for the Earth Award. Yeah, there you go.
Thanks very much. I actually don't like getting awards when we haven't solved the problem. It doesn't feel right. But I had no choice when I was going to refuse to come, but when Marshall when Marshall asked me, I have no choice, because you know, I have to tell you that the person who actually deserves the award is Marshall. What we need to understand, I think, is that the way we're going to win this is from the combination of using the judicial system, which is less sensitive to money than the other branches of government. And so we have a number of lawsuits. The one you've heard about, Our Children's Trust, young people. but also some other important ones, which you'll hear about in due time. And Marshall has been very generous in supporting our organizations. The legal costs are not negligible, and I really appreciate Marshall's support of that, which is crucial. And so, as I say, he's really the one who deserves the award. But thanks very much.
Hi, everyone. I'm Flannery Winchester, CCL's Communications Coordinator. So I'd like to welcome you all again, and I'll be moderating this morning's keynote panel, so I'd like to introduce you to our wonderful panelists here. So you just had a wonderful introduction to Dr. Hansen. He's one of CCL's advisory board members, so let's give him another round of applause. Next, we have Adele Morris. Adele is a senior fellow and policy director for climate and energy economics at the Brookings Institution. And we have also Dr. Natasha DeJarnett. She's a policy analyst in the American Public Health Association's Center for Public Health Policy, and she also just joined CCL's board of directors. And we also are welcoming Trishna Gurung from Ocean Conservancy. She's the Director of Communications and previously worked for the World Wildlife Fund. So the title of this morning's panel is Ripple Effects: Climate Solutions to Benefit Our Environment, Economy, and Health. It's broad, and our panelists have really diverse experience because we wanted to get at this topic from as many angles as possible. And hopefully what you'll take from this discussion is the overarching message that the climate solutions you're working for have really broad implications. They'll help the environment, of course, as well as the economy, our public health outcomes, and even how we communicate with each other. So we'll start with some brief opening questions, and then we'll open it up to Q&A from the audience. So if you have questions, you can write them on cards. They'll be passed out as we're speaking, and then you can take those cards to the back of the room, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. So Dr. DeJarnett, we're going to start with you. So climate change affects the environment, of course, and sometimes it seems like we forget that humans are part of the environment too. Can you give just a quick overview of some of the ways that climate change affects our health?
Absolutely.
Oh, flip it back. It's on already.
Can everyone hear me? Great. Thank you. Thank you for the question. Also, to the esteemed panelists, I'm excited to be sitting alongside you this morning. Honored to be here speaking to Citizens Climate Lobby. The American Public Health Association, we firmly believe that climate change is the greatest threat that we are facing to our human health today, and it's happening now. I don't want this conversation to be a downer, but unfortunately, I have a long list of health impacts to share with you. But there is hope, and I'll end with that. So the reason that we believe it is the greatest threat to human health is because it affects our health in so many different multifaceted ways. Climate change, I'll start with extreme heat events. So climate change is increasing events of extreme heat, the severity and the duration of these events. And this then increases our risk of heat-related illness, including heat stroke and heat exhaustion. This also can have an impact on chronic illnesses like heart disease and asthma, increasing exacerbations of those conditions. And then also along similar lines, it also has a negative impact on those suffering mental health ailments. It can render some psychotropic drugs to be inactive at these extreme temperatures, putting them at even greater health risk. So extreme heat also puts people that work outdoors, perhaps construction workers or agricultural workers, puts them at greater risk occupationally, and then also puts children and elderly also at higher risk. But extreme heat, unfortunately, isn't the only way that climate change is impacting our health. It's also impacting our health by increasing air pollution exposures. So it decreases the quality of the air that we breathe, and this can make folks that have respiratory or heart conditions at a greater susceptibility. It may trigger heart attacks, may trigger asthma attacks, or other related conditions. In addition, because we're having a longer, hotter, warm season, we're having a more intense pollen season. So this can wreak havoc on folks that have allergies, which may not initially sound like a big deal, but this can lead to decreased workplace productivity, absences at work and schools for our children. So not only does it have a burden on our quality of the air that we breathe, climate change also it increases the amount of extreme events, extreme weather events that we're having. It increases both the severity and frequency of these extreme weather events. And so you can think back to last year. Unfortunately, in 2017, we saw 3 major hurricanes that made landfall here in the U.S., Harvey, Irma, and Maria. And you can see from that the devastation, the illness, and injury that was left behind. When we have flooding events, this tends to contaminate our waters, and this increases gastrointestinal illness risk. One study found that among gastrointestinal outbreaks, half of them were preceded by a flooding event. So that increases that risk there as well. Extreme weather events also have a big impact on our mental health. And this can increase anxiety, post-traumatic stress, and other scenarios in those that lived through the event and also those that were displaced by the events. So climate change causes extreme rainfall on one hand, but at the same time, it also causes extreme drought on the other hand. Drought can affect our air quality by, putting such a dry environment, putting more pollutants into our air. Excuse me. It also increases risk of wildfires, and we saw that last year was a particularly devastating wildfire season as well. And that also decreases our air quality, bringing about additional risks to our chronic diseases, like, once again, heart and lung diseases. And then this also has an impact on our agricultural system. So as we're experiencing more drought, coupled with increased carbon dioxide, along with increased temperatures, this is decreasing the amount of nutrients in the crops that we're growing. And the drought is also decreasing the quantity of food that we're growing. So globally, a little bit less in the US, but definitely globally, we're seeing nutrient deficiencies linked with climate change and decreased food security, as well as decreased food quantity. Lastly, I know I'm bringing the room down, and I'm sorry about that. But lastly, climate change is increasing our risk of vector-borne diseases, and these are diseases that are transmitted by insects and ticks, for example. And CDC's Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report just a few weeks ago released a report that said that we are on the rise for vector-borne diseases here in the U.S. So what we'll see here is potentially more cases of Lyme disease, particularly in the Northeast, now that we have a geographic range where their ticks are able to survive longer in these areas where they once weren't habitable. So increases in Lyme disease, increases in West Nile, and then also potentially increases in Zika disease. Unfortunately, there are many health impacts of climate change, and it is our greatest threat to human health, but there's opportunity here. Not only do we at APHA say that it's the greatest threat to human health, we also know that thereby it's the greatest opportunity to impact human health by acting on climate change now. So feel encouraged about what you're doing. What you're doing helps human health. My executive director has said before that whenever we're doing anything that protects health, we're doing the right thing. So feel confident you're doing the right thing. Thank you.
That's really depressing.
I'm sorry.
So if I could add one element of optimism, there's the opinion that, we're now unable to avoid passing targets like 1.5 or 2 degrees warming. Actually, in our paper, Young People's Burden, that we published a year or so ago, we show that if you begin to reduce emissions in 2021, which happens to be after the current administration, and if you reduce emissions 3% a year, you keep warming less than 1.5 degrees Celsius. So that's, and the Citizens Climate Lobby studies that they've supported show that if you had this rising price on carbon, you would reduce emissions by a few percent a year. So it's actually, although that sounds very depressing, but actually it is a solvable problem, but we've got to get that price on carbon.
Thank you, So speaking of studies, in your recent paper, you presented research that adding crushed rock to crop fields is a way to help them pull significantly more carbon dioxide out of the air and sequester it in the soil. Can you tell us a little bit about that study?
Yeah, okay, so the question is, one of the ways, so we are overshooting the amount of carbon that we want in the atmosphere on the long run if we want the ice sheets to be stable, for example, and sea level to be stable. So we're going to have to suck some CO2 out of the atmosphere. Now, I'm sending out a communication today or tomorrow about this topic because last week there was this media coverage of a paper by David Keith in which the media said, oh, sucking CO2 out of the air has become a lot cheaper. Actually, the numbers that they give, which were about $100 to $300 a ton of CO2, sounded smaller than numbers, but that was per ton of CO2. Per ton of carbon dioxide, it's a substantially larger number. But the point is, those numbers are actually, that David Keith is reporting, are larger than the range that we used in our paper, Young People's Burden, which showed that if we don't get on this downward path, the bill for the cost for that we're handing to young people to suck the CO2 out of the atmosphere will be in the trillions of dollars, and it just becomes implausible. So in other words, we're saying we'll be handing them a problem they can't solve. That's why it's so crucial to get this price on carbon. Now, with regard to rock dust, so that's one of the ways. You want to find some ways that make sense for other reasons, and we do need to increase the fertility of the soil, and it's possible that the net result of using silicate rock dust is increase the weathering rate so that you deposit more of the CO2 on the ocean floor as limestone faster. It's a natural process, but you can speed that up and you can improve the fertility of the soil in the process of doing that. But there's a limit as to how much you can get that way. So you don't think that we've found a way which is going to solve the problem. The only way that will solve the problem is to phase down our use of fossil fuel emissions.
So it sounds like you do think that carbon capture and sequestration is an important avenue to explore. Is that something that you think we should include in our carbon fee and dividend plan?
It will come as part of the price, naturally. So if you have a price on carbon, then if someone has a way to prove that they've extracted carbon from the atmosphere, then the person that can be sold to the person who wants to emit, as we still have some continuing emissions as we're phasing those down. So yeah, it actually can be done fairly simply, but the point I want to make is that it's not, we don't have a get out of jail free card. We actually have to reduce our emissions, and we have to do it rapidly, and that's why what you're doing is the crucial thing.
Thank you. So Adele, there are two schools of thought when it comes to carbon. One approach would be to limit emissions by putting a cap on the quantity that we allow, and then one is to limit emissions by setting a price on them. Many economists, including yourself, prefer a straightforward price. Can you explain why?
Sure. And let me start by thanking you and Citizens Climate Lobby for inviting me here today. I'm so excited to be here. I'm a big fan. You guys are having an impact. Don't give up. And how cool is this, right? So please rock on. So Flannery, you're right that economists virtually universally agree that an essential part of a cost-effective approach to mitigating climate change is a price on carbon and other greenhouse gases. So you guys are right on to focus on that. Now, my colleagues at Brookings sometimes make fun of me for having the most self-evident research topic in our building. But I will say what's less self-evident is exactly how to do it, okay? Because it's a combination of getting the technical aspects of the policy right and getting the art of the politics right so that you can actually make it happen and keep it in place. So it's part art and part technical. And so let me give you, I could talk about this all day. This is my day job. I work on carbon tax research every day. But I'll try to keep it short. I'm going to give you 4 reasons why I think a carbon tax or fee approach is going to beat out a cap and trade program in terms of its effectiveness in politics. So first, a carbon tax tells everyone very transparently what profit they're going to make by reducing emissions. This is key. Now, and I think it's especially key in the United States. We have the deepest, richest, most liquid capital markets on the face of the earth. We have the best engineers, the best scientists, the best technologists. And if we harness that profit motive for the benefit of the climate, we will be the crucible in which the technologies that are going to be necessary globally are going to be forged. And so we have to do it in the United States, and a clear, transparent, what we call a hurdle rate in finance will galvanize capital markets to make this happen. I'm convinced of it. And so I know I sound like an economist, but this is really super, super key, is to get that price signal and make it clear. And I think a tax makes that more clear than a cap and trade program where the price can fluctuate and you don't know what it's going to be in 10 years and stuff like that. Okay, so another reason is I think knowing what your tax is going to be or what your price is going to be helps it from going off the rails. And what do I mean by that? So you don't want it too low that nothing actually happens and you don't achieve your environmental goals, but you don't want it so high that it sort of violates the willingness of the American electorate to pay and it just collapses. And I'll give you an example. I was working for the Joint Economic Committee of Congress in 2007, 2008, when oil prices were spiking. And people were calling their members of Congress to do something about oil prices, and there was a real discussion about repealing the federal gasoline tax. And I think there's a limit. You don't want to exceed that limit where people start calling members of Congress and stuff. Your goals are risking a disorderly collapse. So a nice, clear price that you think sort of stays in the bounds. I think is easier to accomplish with a tax than a cap and trade program. Because if you do the cap and trade program, you're going to have price floor and price ceiling. If you're going to do all that, you might as well have a tax, right? So I also think a carbon tax is so much simpler and quicker to administer. So I spent 9 years at the Treasury, and I can tell you we have a very efficient, well-administered excise tax system. We already have a federal system that taxes a lot of fossil fuels. We can set this tax right on top of our existing programs. We can get it up and running. There's no registries, no auctions, no allowance, trade monitoring, none of that stuff. Just slap it on and get her done. Now, finally, I think that a carbon tax has huge diplomatic advantages over either a regulatory approach or a cap and trade approach, because we know what the level of economic ambition is. I was a negotiator for the United States back in the latter days of the Kyoto Protocol, and one of the biggest, most contentious diplomatic issues was how binding everybody's emissions target was. Is it really additional? What kind of effort is going to be necessary to achieve that target? And I can tell you that the same percentage emissions reduction across different countries can have very different economic implications because it depends on what your existing fossil fuel system is, your existing taxes, your economic growth, all sorts of things. It's just not transparent what the economics is of a particular emissions target. But a tax, we know what that is. And so we learned this in the trade context. We gave up on quotas, now we do tariffs. And I'm convinced we're going to do something analogous with carbon policy as well. We're going to end up negotiating around carbon prices because everybody knows what that means, and it builds confidence, and it creates the diplomatic action that we really need. So you might say, Adele, well, why do a tax? Because you don't know exactly what your emissions outcomes are going to be. And so here's my response to that. That's true. We don't know exactly what emissions level we're going to achieve with a particular tax trajectory. However, we have good modeling that tells us basically what we need to get to a particular target, and the modeling's pretty good in the short run. But remember, what causes the damages of climate change is not the emissions in one particular year for one particular country. It's cumulative emissions over longer periods of time all over the world. So we don't need to be fixated on a particular target in a particular year. What we need to be fixated on is creating the underlying conditions in the economy for those long-term emissions reductions, those low-carbon, low-cost technologies that are going to allow low-income countries to decarbonize as well. So that's what I think the policy does that you all are talking about, and that's why I think it's so important, the work that you're doing.
Wonderful, thank you. And I'm glad that you sort of brought in the elements of politics and the rest of the world. That's a perfect place to bring Trishna here into the conversation. So in your work, you've worked on telling stories and communicating internationally. When you were with the World Wildlife Fund, you focused on projects in places like Nepal and the Himalayas. America is unique in its communication around climate change in such that it's such a partisan topic here. So can you speak to the differences in communicating about environmental threats abroad versus here in America? What have you learned?
All right, I'm going to try. Hello, everybody. It's an honor to be here with you. I'm sorry for the cold shoulder to that end of the room. I'm going to try and look around. Namaste also. I am from Nepal, and it's such a privilege to be here with you, seeing you take action with courage and optimism. It's a beautiful thing. I want to take you to about 13 years ago when I was walking the high Himalayas in the shadows of Mount Everest with a 19-year-old Miss Nepal who had never left the capital and a camera crew. We were there to see firsthand the effects and the impacts of climate change in the Himalayas. And let me tell you, even 13 years ago, it was apparent to us because it was real. What we thought were the eternal snows of the Himalayas were receding. Glaciers had gone, and in their place were enormous glacier lakes held back with loose moraine walls. Downstream, we got to talk with community members, one of them a monk who described the terrifying episode of a glacial lake outburst flood. 4 p.m. in the afternoon, he heard rumbles coming down the valley. A wash of water, rocks, mud, trees tearing through the valley, ripping apart the houses, carrying away their cattle, taking away a newly built micro-hydro power that was going to bring light to their village. So for places like Nepal, the reality of climate change was never debated. We always knew that it was real because we were already seeing it. And the way that we told our story and often saw ourselves was as victims. The other side of the equation, really, Flannery, was the United States. And the way that the United States was pitched was the villain. What I have learned, though, in the 10 years after, 10 plus years, is that it is not that narrow a story. Nepal is not just a victim. We are resilient, we are adaptive, we're making changes, we have a climate action plan. Yes, we're still working on the politics of that. but we have amazing programs on the ground, and I encourage you to look at that, some of that, which includes biogas, forest carbon initiatives. People are doing it for themselves, exactly what you are doing here, and this gives me enormous hope and optimism myself. And this is the widening and the broadening of the story that I see here in the United States as well. It is not just what is happening here with this current administration turning its back on the Paris Agreement. It is about people like you. It's about cities and communities and mayors and states standing up and doing what is right for their people. So thank you. To the second part of that question, Flannery, about what I have learned. I have learned, and I beg the pardon of all the scientists and sitting here on stage, the science does not speak for itself. You do. You speak for what is needed. And I would ask and offer to you to come up to these policy conversations rooted in your personal stories. Talk about the local impacts, what it means for your people, what it means for your community and your futures, because that's the common ground that I think brings that Sherpa woman up there who tonight put her child to bed, wants to put food in that child's belly tomorrow and a year from now, wants to make her community safe, a house safe, and celebrate cherished traditions, not so different from those of us in the room today. So let's find that common ground and understand that we share common concerns and common values like fairness, like community, like family, and get the job done. Thank you, CCL.
So we have one final question for Adele about our policy, and then we'll move into audience questions. So if you have some, go ahead and turn them in on your cards. Adele, we were wondering, given that the price of renewables has dropped so significantly in the last few years, do you think that that affects where we should set the price on carbon?
Well, thanks, Flannery. It has been extraordinary to see how the cost of renewable energy has come down. So that's very exciting. It's exactly what we hope to see with other technologies. I think a couple considerations comes up. First of all, the lower cost of renewables absolutely does not mean we don't need a price on carbon, because although that's a wonderful development, there are still lots of sectors, transportation and industrial sectors, that still need incentives, and they need that price signal to develop the technologies that are applicable more broadly. We also need to remember that technology doesn't always favor clean technology. We've seen that fracking and 3D seismic and directional drilling have brought down the cost of oil as well. So, if you just rely on technology by itself without those price signals, you might not like necessarily everything that happens, and you've got to give the incentive and the profit motive to deploy the lower carbon options. Now, you might say, well, what about making the price higher than you otherwise would? And I would say, not necessarily, because of that limit to the willingness to pay of the electorate that I mentioned earlier, and keeping the politics for the policy solid. So I think what we should do is celebrate that lower cost and keep our policy robust, keep the price signal ambitious but feasible, and expect that because of the lower cost renewables, we're going to get a lot more emissions reductions for any given price signal than we would have expected even a few years ago.
Great, thank you. All right, it's your turn. So I'm not sure. Okay, great. So do you just want to read them from there? Yep.
I have lots of questions for you, so we're going to try to keep as many as we can. The first one is for all of you. The information shared on increasing impacts and consequences of climate change are disturbing. Does it increase our challenges of messaging in terms of fostering belief in solutions?
I couldn't really hear.
you repeat the question?
I'm not sure if I can. Stephanie, can you give us the last line again? Really enunciate.
The impacts and consequences that you've all been talking about are disturbing. How does that affect our ability to message solutions?
Okay. How does that affect our ability to message solutions when we know that the effects are so large and so disturbing and here, now?
Well, you'd think it would help, right? And it does seem kind of unfortunate and sort of ludicrous that we're still having this conversation, and we're. So, I mean, I think you've heard a terrific set of talking points here today, and you're learning how to do this. And you know, I, for one, have not figured out, like, the art of the politics yet, and that's why I'm relying on you all.
You know, there's one misconception which has existed for, is my thing working right? Okay. For a long time, and that is that addressing this issue is very expensive. You know, it depends on how you do it, but actually, as the REMI study has showed, and as other studies and common sense tell you, economists tell you that if you make the prices honest, then the economy is more efficient. And so if you can't do it in a sudden jump, but if you have the price of carbon gradually increase so that fossil fuels begin to pay their cost to society, it actually spurs the economy. And it also, this is assuming that you distribute the money 100% to the public. So that a majority of people actually come out ahead. And that's what's needed in order to keep the price rising. Because if we get this started, it will run by itself, practically. Because the public will not want to remove a price on carbon if they're getting this dividend. So this idea that, well, yeah, there are problems with climate change, but it's too expensive to do anything about it. That's completely wrong. So that's what we have to be able to communicate to the public, and that's what, you know, we would have hoped that when Obama was elected, that he would have tried to make this story clear. Well, the next president that's elected we'd better make sure that president actually makes this story clear, because you have to communicate with all the public, and even though our numbers are growing, it's still somebody who's got the ability to get the whole public listening has got to make this story clear.
Thank you. Next question.
Do you feel like politicians are adequately aware of all the topics that you mentioned, science, health, or what are topics that we should be talking to them about?
Can you? Great. Yes and no. I certainly think that messages could be communicated more effectively so that this message is received by those decision makers, that climate change is real, it's happening now, it's affecting our health, but there is something that we can do about it. I think that the message that they've received for a long time is that this is something far off in the future, and this is about ice caps and polar bears. And it is about ice caps and polar bears, but it's also about my grandmother. It's also about my future children. It's also about your children. It's about people of color. It's about people with disabilities, it's about vulnerable populations and protecting them and their health. And taking this action is good for the economy. That's also been a narrative that's gone on for a long time, that this is going to be too expensive, people are going to lose jobs, and we can't handle that. But we can have a just transition so that people that work in coal mines, et cetera, will be able to transition to other jobs as we grow our renewable energy economy, and that we are going to save money and time by enacting this policy and increase our economy. So the messages, they may be there, but I don't think that it's been clearly conveyed what the exact issues are and what is at stake.
Trishna, could you weigh in maybe on communicating specifically with politicians, if there's anything that you have to share with our volunteers?
I'll be honest, they're a little bit of a special breed unto themselves. And honestly, it's because I'm sure in their offices they've got 100 issues thrown at them at any given hour, and they simply don't have the bandwidth to deal with it. So I'm going to turn to you and say that was excellent advice. One of the things that we at Ocean Conservancy have done, and I think pretty successfully, is work on bipartisan support on an issue like ocean acidification. And the way that we succeeded at it was recognizing really that climate change is divisive. There are walls that are going up when you even say those words. So we had, after extensive research, come up with a formula, if you will, which goes like this. You establish the problem, you establish the urgency, and then you offer the solution and the role that people have to play in it. It sounds simple, and in execution it actually is. And what we also did was back it up with stories, and I'm a big fan of stories because it bridges that divide. And also, it's really difficult to refute a story. You can't say that didn't happen to you, because clearly it did. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Oh, sure. Adele would like to weigh in.
Yeah, so one part of this is this fear that taking action is going to be really expensive. And I think the message from the economic literature has not gotten out. And I can just tell you, I just finished co-chairing a major multi-model analysis of scenarios of a U.S. carbon tax. And I can tell you that the 11 models that run all these scenarios tell us that reducing emissions with a good quality policy design is not costly. It's not going to be the end of the American manufacturing sector or whatever the other disinformation that comes from Koch brother funded activities at other think tanks that shall not be named, okay? So I think in addition to arming yourself with these important talking points about health and your personal stories, kind of feel confident that you have the economic science behind you as well as the physical science. So I just, you know, you're saying the right things, and feel confident about that.
Wonderful. Thank you for that addition. She said, what path forward do you see for coping with increasing disasters and cascading effects? You guys are not giving us easy questions here, are you?
Do you want to take that one? Yeah, you know, the threat is real. You know, I go back to 1982. We wrote our first major paper in 1981. And in 1982, Taro Takahashi at Lamont Geophysical Observatory, and I organized a symposium in which ExxonMobil Research and Engineering actually was a sponsor of that, and the dinner speaker was E.E. David Jr., who is the president of Exxon Research and Engineering. And he correctly identified the most fundamental aspect of this science issue, and that is, he said, well, if you have a system in which you have delayed response, and that's our real problem because of the oceans and the ice sheets don't respond quickly. So we're setting up a system where our children and grandchildren will feel most of that. But he said, if you have a system with a delayed response, and a system that's dominated by amplifying feedbacks, which our climate system is, then he says that's a very dangerous situation. You can lose control of the system. You can, unless you have anticipation. And the obvious anticipation that you need is, oh, we have to find some energy sources that don't produce CO2. Well, what Exxon Research and Engineering then did was begin to work on fracking, which this is exactly the worst thing you can do. Now, what's the relevance of this? The relevance is that the climate system, there is a danger that ice sheets will begin to disintegrate and it becomes out of our control. To avoid that, we need to keep the warming below, I'd say even below 1.5 degrees, and then begin to decrease. And we can do that with the reduction of emissions of 3% a year, which is possible with the price on carbon. So it's a solvable problem. There is a danger that we hand young people a system that's out of their control. But the way to avoid that is exactly what you're trying to do.
And I would just add that this question illustrates the fact that a price on carbon is necessary, but it's not sufficient. We need policies to adapt and make our economy and our built environment and everything else more resilient to the kind of impacts that we're seeing and that you talked about. And so I think we need infrastructure that is well designed for a changing climate. We need agricultural systems and land use patterns and all sorts of other things that are going to protect us from what are probably going to be some inevitable damages. But we don't have to just sit there and take it. We can have policies that reduce the untoward impacts and help people who are vulnerable avoid some of those things that we see coming in, ahead of us.
I'm going to sound like a copycat. 100% agree. We've certainly been talking a lot about mitigation. We've got to mitigate. We've got to stop this in the future, but at the same time, we can't negate adaptation. We have to adapt to what's happening now. So we need cross-sectoral partnerships. We need people to work across land use and planning and health and economy, and we need everybody to be able to work together on this so that we can create solutions. Therefore, we will be prepared for disaster instead of reacting to disaster. We'll build cooling centers so that people can cool off on extremely hot days. We will have emergency preparedness ramped up and ready when they know that a storm is coming. We'll have systems in place so that people will be able to safely evacuate. And not just those that can afford to evacuate, but those that cannot afford to evacuate but are there on the front lines of the storms. And at the same time as all this is happening, we have to mitigate. So once again, the work that you're doing is right on path with that. And on both sides, we're helping health in the end.
Thank you. I'd love if you could just expand a little bit more on I'd love if you could expand a little bit more on you mentioned frontline communities and vulnerable communities. Can you just talk a little bit more about that for folks who are maybe less familiar with the outsized impact that will be on those people?
Thanks for asking. We have several groups that are very vulnerable to the health impacts. There are children. They're completely reliant on adults. They are not able to make decisions, to protect themselves and keep themselves safe and healthy. They're also smaller, and they have developing organ systems, so they're more susceptible. There are elderly folks that are more susceptible because they tend to have other chronic conditions that render them a bit more vulnerable, and maybe a little bit more socially isolated. There are people of color and low-income communities that often live on these front lines. Often in environmental health, when we talk about front lines, we're talking about people that are living on the fence line of industry, so they're having higher pollution exposures. But in the case of climate change, frontline folks may be coastal communities. Frontline folks may be folks that are living near wildfire-prone areas. Really, it's all of us. None of us are exempt from the effects of climate change. But some of us are a bit more vulnerable and a bit less resilient. So actions that we can take towards adaptation and mitigation will render us all more resilient and make us better in the end.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
So I think we have time for just one last question.
I think we're actually out of time, but
Oh, okay, we'll wrap it up.
We're going to take 10 seconds to get everything off the stage, and if you could all wait to ask any further questions of the panelists until the break, that would be really appreciated.
Yeah, so I'll just say thank you all again for sharing your expertise with us this morning.
Thank you.
Check, 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 check.
Hey there, CCL family. I'm Lene Pettengill, your Development Director. It's my joy and honor to serve in this position. It's also been quite a wild ride the last 5 years. Right before I joined the staff in 2013, our annual combined budget for CCL and sister nonprofit CCE was $430,000, and we had just over 1,000 supporters. Fast forward to 2018. Right now we have over 100,000 supporters, and our budget, woot woot. And our budget this year is $5.2 million. Which sounds like a lot of money, especially when you're the development director. But when you compare it to that of other green NGOs who have budgets of several $100 million, you realize we're the lean, scrappy kid on the block getting a whole lot done without a whole lot of money, relatively speaking. We've been told by many other NGOs that we have the most lobby meetings of any organization. Yeah. We'll never know for sure because no one's required to report on the number of lobby meetings they have, just the amount they spend on lobbying, but it appears that we do have the most by far. I honestly believe you cannot make a better investment of your charitable dollar than in the work of this lean, scrappy organization. We will always be grassroots, volunteer-driven. When you donate to our work, you are donating to support the systems which empower and embolden our volunteers to reach their own personal greatness as they effectively work for climate change solutions. Now, I have a question for you to ponder. Have any of you in this room tapped into your personal greatness as you do this work? Have you maybe surprised yourself achieving something nothing short of remarkable? If I had to make a guess, that guess would be that pretty much every one of you in this room could answer yes to that question. I have another question for you to ponder. Have any of you ever struggled in your work with CCL? Have you hit some bumps or maybe mountains as you attempted to launch a group or secure a congressional meeting or land that key endorsement? I'm also guessing that most, if not all of you, in this room would answer yes to that question as well. And yet, you persevered. I want to share the story of one of our volunteers, whose name is Princella Talley from Alexandria, Louisiana. You might, yeah, you might relate. She has a fan club out there. You might relate to some of the same challenges and triumphs that she has experienced. Princella joined CCL 2 years ago, and not long after came major flooding in Louisiana following Hurricane Harvey. Starting a chapter at that time and in the heart of the Deep South was anything but smooth. Princella worked for months to recruit locals to join her fledgling group, and months turned into more than a year, waiting, holding out faith that others would eventually join her. But Princella persevered, navigating over those speed bumps and around those mountains until she'd created a thriving chapter. Now, to share a few words about her work and her CCL journey, please give a warm welcome to Princella Talley.
Hi. I didn't expect that. Okay. So to give you guys a little more insight about how our group got started, we first discovered CCL in 2016, and we didn't become an official group until 2018. And over the course of those 2 years, we were talking to members of our community about the impact climate change was having on our city and on the world. And nobody was argumentative to that fact, but they were very dismissive. Because in our city, a lot of people don't feel that their voices matter. So empowerment, it usually gives way to frustration. And I can relate to that because before CCL, I had very little interest in expressing my political will. And that would make it even more interesting when I tried to talk about CCL with other people, because I'd say, oh, the great thing about being a new chapter is we're gonna learn so many new things together. But that was really me saying, I have no idea what I'm doing. So fast forward to mid-2017, we still had no members and we pretty much given up. And then there was Brett Cease, CCL's Volunteer Education and Engagement Coordinator. It was also Jessica Schultz, CCL Lafayette's co-leader, and all the other chapter leaders in our state who kept asking about us. Even when we weren't taking any action, they refused to give up on us. So we had a choice to make in Alexandria because we realized that people actually cared about us in CCL, and we decided to keep trying. So in January of 2018, we started our group officially with 10 members. As I stand here today, we have 14. We have 3 endorsements from community leaders and the and the principal of Alexandria Junior High is now working to add climatology to the school curriculum. So I would just like to say all of our stories are very different, but there's always someone rooting for you. And CCL has shown us not to focus on those differences, but to focus on making an impact instead. Thank you.
Thank you, Princella. I am humbled and inspired every day by your generosity. I know that you are stretching to donate what you can in addition to your amazing volunteer work. And whether that stretch for you is $50 or $5,000 or much more, I greatly appreciate every single one of your donations. Thank you. So I have one request to share before I wrap up. This year, we're hoping to recruit 100 donors whom we refer to as Women Who Will and Generous Gentlemen. These donors each commit to giving $10,000. And together, hopefully, we'll be able to create a $1 million matching gift pool for our year-end appeal. So far, 71 of you have said yes to this challenge. I'm hoping that 20 more of you will join this group today. If you think you might be able to say yes to this great stretch or know someone who could, please see me or another member of the development team, Andy Beers, Ashley Skoke. Andy, if you could, and Ashley, if you could stand up, wave your hands, my awesome, awesome colleagues. We'll be right up front here at the break. Or you could also reach out to me later using the contact info on the inside of the back cover of your annual report that you received in your blue folder. And for those of you watching via live stream, just contact the home office. We'll be thrilled to hear from you. And Princella will also be up front with us for those of you who want to give her a high five or a hug. And I checked, she's okay with hugs. Thank you so much for your perseverance, for not letting those speed bumps or mountains stop you, for working towards and at times reaching your own personal greatness. And thank you for the hope that you give others as you shine your light so brightly in this world. I love you guys.
Okay, thank you all for being on time this morning. We'll be starting again at precisely 10:45. Please make sure you're back in your seats by then. Thanks, everybody.